All right, Zach. So I'm going to talk about mythology broadly. Then I might touch on the UNESCO thing at the end. It's a little divisive. But let's just start with history and myth for a second. There is a myth that almost every secular person believes, regardless of culture. So let's start with the broadest myth I can think of. And let me tell you the story. The story is this. In the beginning, there was a big bang. The universe began to expand. Millions of years later, there was light. There was a star that went supernova and released all the heavy metals that make up our solar system. The gas and particles accreted into an accretion disk. Eventually, in the center of that disk, the star was formed, our sun. And the planets accreted around it, and our solar system was formed. Somewhere during that time period, life emerged, probably from the proteins and the carbon. And anyway, millions of years of evolution later, the plants, the animals, they all became more complex. Multicellular life formed. And then eventually, finally, after the dinosaurs died, the age of the mammals arrived, and finally, man emerged. Now that's a myth. Although every single part of that story is true, it's a myth. What makes it a myth? Well, the definition of a myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people, or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings, but not always. What makes the story of mankind a myth? Well, it's centered around us. It's centered around us in a way that makes us the focal point of the story. You see, at the end of the story, we always ended in finally mankind appeared. As though mankind was the reason why all the preceding happened. Mankind is somehow the ultimate purpose behind the story. And finally mankind appeared. We didn't end the story with finally jellyfish appeared. Because ending the story with finally jellyfish appeared would be silly. But what if we went back in time 200 million years, and when jellyfish was the most complex animal on Earth? And the jellyfish were telling the story. You know how they would tell the story? The jellyfish would say, and finally, after all the Big Bang and accretion, and jellyfish appeared. Assuming, of course, that jellyfish was the end-all and be-all of evolution. Now, all right, so I'm going to wrap that story up. Because once you're able... So once we put that into a box of mythology, that even the story, the scientific story about the evolution of man, like how did we come to be here, all of those individual facts are true. The story is a myth. And once we can wrap our head around that, we can get out of this whole notion that mythology has to be linked to religion. That it has to be like the Torah or the Tanakh or the Bible or something like that to be a myth. It does not have to be. Now, segueing from that more broad perspective of mythology, let's talk about a mythology that just happened on Monday. I mean, a mythology that kind of impacted America on Monday, and that was Columbus Day. For many Americans, the story of Columbus is a binding cultural story that kind of holds the glue, the fabric of America together. Columbus goes part and parcel with the early pilgrims and the settlers of America who escaped religious tyranny to come to America for freedom. Unfortunately, for Americans and for the story, it leaves out so much of the historical facts surrounding the story. Obviously, now we know that actually other Europeans had already discovered the continent of America, as far as the Vikings. We also know, of course, that humans were already here. This was not some place to be discovered. Humans were already living in America. But because they were not civilized, we have always considered them to be somehow subhuman. And after, of course, the colonization of America, and for many reasons, the loss of millions of indigenous peoples, it's always been more comforting to relegate the natives to being subhuman as opposed to just as human as the Europeans, and destroying the story. Because the myth and the story is what's so important. Because without the story, everything else falls apart. Some of the things that bind America, our cultural telling of our own history, falls apart. Okay. So, history obviously can be a myth. History. You can have all the things in the story be true, and the story will still be a myth. And sometimes a harmful myth. Now, going to UNESCO specifically. Look, obviously, you, Stephen, you guys are more aware of Jewish history than I am. But I'll tell you one small snippet of the article that really got to me and really flows with this whole mythology theme. And that is the blockade that Israel has done. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I don't know if it was Stephen Ness or if it was Druckmann himself, but I had this long, it may have even been Evan Park. But I had Evan Park, that's what it was. I had a long, multi-day argument where I had to find articles or resources to prove that there was ever even a blockade. So Evan Park would not allow himself to believe that there was ever a blockade. And of course, UNESCO brought that up when they made some of the decisions they've made, when they denounced Israel behind the blockade that started back in 2007, remember? I'm sure you know. But it's so funny how when you need a story to be true, when you need a cultural binding story to bring everybody together, then you immediately deflect and reject and become defensive whenever any information comes to harm the story. Now, the mythology does not always have to be about the past. Sometimes it can be this ongoing story that we tell ourselves that occur day to day. It carries on with us. A good example of that is America itself, the office of the presidency, the Congress. And I think that a lot of us believe in kind of this mythos surrounding the institutions that hold America together, despite the fact that we can see with our own eyes how flawed those institutions are. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. That's my whole mythology video. So take from it what you want. And, I don't know, discuss it with me.